Hi, Tim here, and welcome to another painting video, this time a very complex subject. We're painting Varanasi in India on the River Ganga. This is an edited recording of the live demo I gave to my Patreon members, and when we join the demo shortly, you'll hear me talk more about the scene. But I have an acronym for helping you tackle a complex process. It's important to break things down into steps when handling a complex painting subject. That structured process helps you break the project into sort of manageable steps, making it less overwhelming and a bit more achievable. It's also a good idea to have a plan as well. Complex subjects require a bit more thinking about than a simple one. So my acronym of the 6 Ds of watercolor, which I was reminded about by one of my Patreon members on the call, is a really helpful acronym to guide you through the steps required for handling a particularly complex painting subject. The first D I'm going to mention is decision, decide. Decide on your painting subject. In this demo, I'm painting Varanasi. That's what I've decided to do. But as you look through, say, your own photos or other images that you're going to base your painting on, some of them are going to be easier than others. You've got to look at them and think, how easy are they to paint? How easy can I tackle this subject in watercolor? Some will be better than others. Some will be a little bit easier for you to tackle. This is a very complex one. This is why I particularly am applying those the 6 Ds, the other 5 Ds I'm going to take you through this demo, to help you break down the individual steps of handling a very complex subject like this. So anyway, let me get into the demo. We'll be joining this live call, a recording of this live call, just as I'm going through the subject in a little bit more detail, trying to break it down into easier steps and unpick it and think about the process in which we're going to tackle this scene. Hopefully you can see now the source photo of this exceedingly difficult scene. Yes, it's Varanasi on the Ganges, on the Ganga River. And we discussed last night that the complexity of the scene, these very complex buildings, all sorts of different shapes of buildings. There's the 3 temples in the middle, these temples here. So one silhouetted against the sky, and there's a slightly larger one on the left there, and then a little bit of a smaller one there on the right. These levels of buildings going down to the shoreline of the Ganga, and these steps, which are called ghats. I've been trying to practice that all day with the correct pronunciation, but those steps leading down to the shoreline. And then there's a few figures dispersed all over the place on the steps, on these boats in the foreground. I guess we've got 3 main elements to it. There's the sky, a thin slither of sky at the top. Then the main part of the composition is going to be all those buildings there. And then right down the bottom, we've got the river. Over by the shoreline, we've got those boats, various boats, different colors of boats, yellows and reds. Talking about colors, we've got lots of warm colors here, lots of ochres and siennas and yellows and browns and reds, lots of warm colors, giving it. And I think that the photo was taken. I should give a shout out to fellow member Ravi B for the kind sharing of his source photo. Thanks very much, Ravi. Super photo. And we all believe that this is taken in the late afternoon or evening. We've got the light coming in, very warm light coming in, sort of really making everything so much warmer. Beautiful colors. We've got a few little dabs of other colors, that blue tarpaulin, for example. Some of the clothing and some of the figures, the saffron, which was pointed out. Now, as regards composition, yes, it's a difficult scene, but for this, you can follow your own route. Okay, so we did discuss some other options on the composition. but from my point of view, I am going to keep true to the scene, and a suggestion from fellow members last night was remove the background temple there, high up on the banks. Kind of remove that very modern building. There's an assortment of buildings here, and we wondered, how on earth do they get permission to build on these? And in recent times, there would have been steps leading down between these two temples. There would have been steps leading down. You'll find some older images on the web as regards what this scene looked like 20, 30, 40 years ago, or way back. And unfortunately, commercialism has taken over the scene as a very popular site for rituals and so on, and gatherings. And so we've got these sort of makeshift buildings, these very stark, squarish buildings there, being built along the shoreline. And we guess that these tarps may be hiding some other construction work. And so in time, those steps will unfortunately vanish. So going back to my thoughts on the composition, I'm going to keep true to the scene, but I'm going to move this red boat here, try and make that a little bit larger, and also, if you imagine it, trying to make it appear in that kind of area there. Yes, so we discussed last night on Pat Chat maybe the moving of this left-hand temple just slightly to the left, giving us a little bit more of a space between the background temple and this one, yet still trying. We've got some lovely contrast there. The light's coming from the right, of course. We've got the light hitting that right-hand side of that temple tower, and the shadow behind it. Quite nice. We also discussed shadow shapes last night, the kind of stepped pattern, the geometric pattern of shadows starting from the skyline, following the vertical line of these buildings, then maybe a little bit of a horizontal, and then we have another vertical, that kind of pattern going down, which is sort of emphasizing that sort of step pattern as we're going down there. Other options for you on composition, and Chris has actually been quick on the gun and submitted a composition for me. I think Chris has actually zoomed in on the scene. So you could zoom in on the scene. You could go vertical in this. I've got landscape orientation. You could go vertical, maybe just taking those two temples there. Just imagine a kind of vertical composition there, or maybe just over to the right, have that temple there being on the left, and then we've got those steps leading down to the river as another vertical composition. So yeah, you could zoom in on any part of the scene, maybe the temples. To zoom back out, maybe the temples there. Again, think about the orientation of that. Maybe vertical might be a little bit better, or possibly focus on the steps coming down. Those two figures there bathing. This guy here, the boats as well. Yeah, so don't necessarily think if this is too complicated, copy the photo, all right? Just zoom in on a particular element of it. Just have fun. Don't get stressed out by making it all too difficult. Now for this, you may want to, those of you watching live, you may want to just watch me go through my particular process and ask me questions as I go through, or again, like some of you, I know Barb may like to keep a little sketchbook going, your thoughts on, like a sort of practice sketch painting of the scene. So you might like to do that. And then, of course, you've got that recording, so you can actually do it in your own time at your leisure. Right, let me stop sharing my screen and go back to me. There we go. Right, let me describe my materials. So as per usual, normal materials, no change. Paper is Saunders Waterford. Cold press paper, 300 grams, 140 pounds, 15 inches by 11 inches. Paints are from Mark Jackman in the UK. Handmade, professional grade paints. Colours are neutral. I will describe this as I go through. I've got neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, spring green, viridian green. Won't be using too many of the greens today. Viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, light red or English oxide. Be using a fair bit of that, and also that cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, lavender, quinacridone gold. That might be another nice color to introduce into the scene in a few places to get that really sort of very warm yellowy brown. And then I've got a few gouache colors here, a light yellow gouache and a white. Brushes wise, I'll be introducing those, but most likely most of the painting will be done with my brush of the moment, a Tintoretto synthetic mop brush with hopefully a good point to it, and then followed up by, for more of the detail work, well, this is a Winsor & Newton Cotman, but basically a synthetic round brush, again with a good point. Possibly I might be using a rigger for some of the verticals that we see in the scene. Right, so yeah, as I said, I was going to, for me, I'm going to follow the composition of the scene. And the most important thing, I think, is getting the skyline right, the waterline right, and those three temples, okay? And I think the photo that our subject photo for me is pretty much it, bar some little minor adjustments as well that we discussed on Pat Chat. Right, let me just check for any questions. Right, first question from Ben. In my test painting, oh yes, I did a test painting the other day. What colors did you use for the warm and cool shadows? Mainly burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, Ben. All right. The colors of the shadows and the car shadows. And Mark, please can you reiterate your process of the 5Ds and how it applies to this painting? Yes, my 5Ds, let me explain that, which I've shared with Mark and a few other people a number of times. I haven't actually sort of promoted it in any way, but yeah, so the 5Ds, first of all, the first D is deciding what to paint. Is it paintable, the subject that you've got? The second D is design. You're thinking about composition. The third D is draw, drawing the scene. Then the next D is daubing. I might actually end up with 6 Ds here, Mark. The next D is daubing, laying down some paint, covering the white paper, all right, except for those areas that you want to preserve light, in that you want a very light area, or you're going to paint that object in a particular way, but basically covering most of the paper. The next D, the darks, getting in the shadows, creating some form to the objects that you see. And the last D, details. I think it's 6 Ds, Mark, sorry. Yeah, the 5 or 6 Ds of my particular process. Anyway, let me crack on. Hopefully that answers your question, Mark. As always, the challenge is knowing where to start. And that would be either, for me, two options of where to start drawing, either on the focal point and then working your way out, or me being right-handed, I just tend to work from the left-hand side and then sort of fill in the main objects, the main shapes as I progress across the paper. I think in this one, I might actually concentrate on those three temples first. Let's get in those first, all right? Starting with the one at the back that's going to be silhouetted against the sky. Make sure I've got enough lead in the pencil. Right, that one at the back, which is the most intricate of the lot because it's got three smaller towers at the base of the tower. So let's get that in there. And these towers at the top, they've got a sort of curved top to them. In fact, let's get this in very loosely first of all. So that's the first temple, and then the next one, actually let's get this one over a little bit more. The objective here, as I say, it's a complex scene, complicated scene. Let's try and simplify things and just get in the main shapes. Right, and then we've got the third temple on the right. This is a little bit more squarish rather than round, I reckon. And it's got some extensions to the front that lead down to the shoreline. The overall shape of the overall angle of the skyline is, it's not horizontal, but it's going a little bit down to the right. So a bit higher on the left. And we'll miss out the pink building behind that main tower there. And then we've got some buildings going down to the right like that. This one needs to be a little bit slimmer. That's a bit too fat, a bit too wide there. Okay, we're gradually come down, try and get the shoreline. I'm going to try and get the shoreline in and then fill in the gaps, add a little bit more detail to some of those main shapes of buildings. The shoreline for me is going to be round about there, I guess. And the shoreline is it horizontal? No, it goes up ever so slightly to the right. So skyline at the top going down a little bit, and then shoreline goes up just by, if I can use metric terms, just by a few millimeters. So up a little bit like that, okay. Boats, let's get in some boats. And I wanted that main red boat, the red boat that's nearest to us, a little bit larger and a little bit more over to the right, kind of balancing out. We've got those two temples there, that one there, and then I think if it's around about there, If it was there, there'd be too much going on in the middle and then nothing here. But if it was just slightly sort of there, I think that would, or maybe just a little bit more there. That would balance things out quite nicely. Not too low, don't want it too low. And it's sort of, the top of the boat is sort of in line with the shoreline. We've got a key figure in there as well. And there's another figure as well. So we have a figure standing in the boat. So that could be a focal point. These boats are quite simple to do, almost like a sort of banana shape with the bow just slightly raised up. There's the other boats, a number of boats connected with each other on the left. All right, so that's my shoreline. Back to those buildings, just get in, not all the detail, just the main shapes. All right, and get in some of these lines of perspective. So if we've got a line going down like that, the eye line, the horizon, is going to be possibly around there. And then we've got intersecting the two. So that's the skyline, that's my horizon. Then, you know, lines between the two. Just think about those lines as well. Just a few lines just to help guide me on some of the angle of the rooftops of those buildings. So we're going to ignore the modern sort of pinkish building there. That's the little spire on top of the tower. Just continuing along the back of the city. So that's dark in there. That's dark in there. Just use a bit of cross-hatching just to identify those darker areas. Right. Main temple comes out to the right-hand side, and that's that brownish color. That's that brownish color down there. We've got some steps appearing here. We've got some steps on the right-hand side. Now, coming down to the shoreline, there are these squarish constructions, which we don't know exactly what they are, but they're kind of hiding, obscuring these lovely steps coming down, which we'll imagine some of these going in. All right, some steps there. Maybe something dark against that. So that's a light figure, a light top, darker background. Do a bit of negative painting around that. So there might be some kind of shadow. The shadow behind that figure. Temple. So if I call this temple number 1, temple number 2, temple number 3, for reference purposes. And we've got the building, temple number 3, the front of that coming down. That's all in the shadow as well. That's in the shadow. There's a construction just to the left of temple number 1. Don't know what it is, but it's narrow at the top, then widens out, but it's creating a lot of cast shadow over to the left. And as I pointed out on Pat Chat last night, this whole central area here is really complicated with the tarpaulin covers, those temporary tarpaulin covers, and then at the shoreline, these connected square buildings with square windows, some sort of open square window. Not sure if it's a shrine or something, but a lot of those on the shoreline. I'm not going to bother putting in the windows. There's hundreds of windows in the scene. But the main thing is getting the buildings right and just the impression of those buildings. Don't need to be 100% correct. Just try and get in the placement of those 3 temples, their relative size as well, and then just some of the main building shapes, and boats on the river, on the Ganga. Perhaps have a few more figures in here. So these figures are quite close to us. And a few more little roof lines going over to the right. I think that's about it. I'm just looking at the drawing now, just to doubly make sure these boats don't look. I've got that main blue boat bow. But there's a nice boat actually with a guy. At the back of the boat, just, I guess, just navigating it into the shore. There we go. Right, just back to these temples, just get in the main architectural details, not all the sort of very ornate vertical moldings to the tower, but just get in the main shapes, and there's a sort of very ornate entrance. There we are. I think that will do for me. If I put in more detail, I will go ultra tight, which is I don't want to do. I want to keep it loose and very sort of creating the impression of the scene. If I put in too much detail, I'll just get bogged down with that, and I will lose that sort of loose impression of it. Right. Let me just see if there's any other questions. Don't think there is. Well, let me then start going back to Mark's 5Ds or 6Ds. So we've done the deciding what to paint. We've designed the scene. We've gone through composition. We've done the drawing. That might be our first our 3Ds, Mark. Fourth D, daubing. Let's get some paint on that paper. Right. So sky is going to be a warmish blue, yet sort of fairly opaque. I think for me, on my palette, a cerulean blue would be quite good, a cerulean blue with cobalt blue, or a cerulean blue with lavender. And I'm going to bring it over the, as I did with my practice painting a couple of days ago, bring it over the edges of the buildings, bring it down, and then quickly then go in with the base color of those buildings, the yellows, the pinks, the browns. All right. So you will see me, when I get to that phase, you will see me mucking about with the painting, using wet and wet, a number of different watercolor techniques, wet in wet, dropping in more color while the surface is still damp, maybe lifting off if I've gone in too heavy with the application of paint, lifting off with a paper tissue. So plenty of color mixing, soft edges, and we'll let that dry. So we're going to cover the whole scene, but let that dry before we then go in with the dark shadows. All right, so brush, a good mop brush with a good point. I prefer a good quality synthetic brush, but a brush of your choice, something that's going to hold a lot of water, and something's got a good point to it as well, and a good edge. A good edge. All right. And let's load up the brush then with that. Combination maybe of cerulean blue and this lavender. And then just apply some paint. Now that's too light. I know that. On my practice painting, I had to do the sky twice, which is a no-no for me, because if I do the sky twice, I lose the freshness. I think I might have pulled it around with the practice painting, but I want to try and get it right with this one. So, as you know, watercolor dries lighter, so we've got to compensate. This is my daubing action. You could, the traditional way of laying down a wash is with the board on an angle, laying it down, getting a bead, using gravity to come down. But I prefer, for a sky like this, there's not a big area, but getting some little subtle variations in intensity of that sky color, even mixing it on the paper. Cerulean blue, so it's quite opaque, this combination. There we are, going over the building. Cerulean blue, lavender, maybe a little bit darker on that left-hand corner because the light's coming from the right. So in the source photo, you will see it's a little bit lighter on that side compared to that side. It's actually granulating quite nicely here, which I don't mind. It's a personal sort of thing, that granulation. Oops, I picked up a bit of quinacridone gold, doesn't matter. Maybe a little bit lighter towards the buildings. Yes, so that should be all right. Of course, that tower is going to be darker than the surrounding areas. Now, let me go in with the lighter building color. That sort of, I'm constantly thinking about what color that might be. A yellowy, pinky color, maybe. So it's a bit of experimentation here to try and replicate that color, which is sort of, it's got that evening sun glaring against it. So let's start off with a yellow ochre, maybe a little bit of cadmium red, and then just lay it down and think. Some spots have gone into the sky, doesn't matter. A little bit of yellow, trying to get that color. Yellow ochre, cadmium red. This has got to be quite light here. If it's not light enough, I will have to go in and compensate with the sky. Again, that's going to dry lighter, but with the shadows as well, that could make the scene a little bit lighter. Right, red, yellow ochre. And generally the buildings are a little bit darker towards the shore, just a tiny, tiny bit. We'll keep this theme going on over here. Come back to these temples in a minute. Let's get in, the temples are a bit darker, but let's get in these main buildings first of all. And it doesn't matter if you leave little bits of the paper unpainted. They could be made into something, a tarpaulin cover, a sign, or something like that. So it doesn't matter if you leave part of the scene unpainted. I'm down to the tops of the boats and the shoreline. And be careful with the lighter clothed figures. Just paint around those. Over the darker figure, because that's going to be darker. I'm going to paint around these boats, leave the boats unpainted. Paint around the figure. and then down to the water. Getting the base color of the reflections in the water, which is going to be a darker version of what we've got above. We'll be going over the top of this with the blue. So it is a bit darker. The water's a bit darker than the buildings above. Just getting something warm there, but generally a little bit darker than the buildings above. A lot of this is going to be covered with a blue glaze over it for the water and the waves. Just mop up the bead there. Right, I need to get back to my temples. So I've got burnt umber here. Less water on the brush because I am now going in with this darker color. The paper's still damp. It's actually quite a little bit too damp, really. It just, oh, that's drier actually. So just watch. You want the paper surface to be a little bit damp, all right, to get that soft edge. Now I need to be a bit careful here. So I've got burnt sienna, burnt umber. I think that's a good color. Good color for the temples. So the temple comes out a little bit to the right, down to a sort of platform there. And then temple number 1. Get in the tower, and then the base of the tower. It's a little bit redder. So not this, the ratio of paint to water. I've got more paint now on my brush than water, all right? And just watch my point on the brush. Let's get in temple number 3. Temple number 3 is a little bit grayer. It's not so warm as that. So a little bit of cobalt blue or ultramarine blue just to grey it down a bit. The temple here has got a little bit of a brown layer to it coming down. The building at the top is a little bit browner. Like that. I think I'm nearly there for the underlying color. Now, if you do think it's a little bit too light, a little bit too dark, the light buildings, you can, with a paper towel or tissue, with a smooth surface, I find it's best just to dampen this a little bit. Otherwise, if you go down too dry, it sort of, it could take up too much and give you a bit of a hard edge around that lighter area. So I'm just going to dampen this on a sponge. So that's now damp, and you might find it just lifts it up a bit more. So we can just gently just touch the surface, lift off that paint there. Do you see? Just I've actually got a pot of water just to my right, so I'm just going to dampen that again, and it's quite light there as well. It's quite light there on a sort of terrace across the, I'm not sure if it is a terrace, but so you can see I'm lifting off quite a bit of that paint. Let's just pick a new surface here. So smooth surface there. Dab it in some water. Do you see it's a little bit light? It's too much water, just tap it off in a sponge, and where else is it quite light? Just there. We're getting a little bit of variation in the values there. And so it's not so, with a large area like this, we want it to make it a little bit more interesting, not so flat and boring. It will with the shadows, hopefully that will just liven things up a bit and give us a bit more form and interest. But yeah, just to while the paper's still damp, just gently lifting it off there. Okay. I think that is all right. Sometimes I use my finger, excuse me, to just, well, obviously test how damp it is, but also that can just lift things off a little bit. Not as good as a damp paper towel. Yeah, I think the sky is pretty much all right. I reckon I think if I went over that again, it would make this lighter, but it would be too dark. Yeah, it would be too dark. Right, so I'm just going to let that dry a little bit. It's actually drying quite nicely. I generally have a humidity reader here, temperature humidity reader. I'm not sure what it is at the moment. Maybe 50, 60%, something like that. so it's sort of drying sort of average amount of time. I'm still going to keep next phase with the darks, all right. The what's that? The 50, the 4th or 50. So keeping with my mop brush, and but I do need this to be dry. I might just, so as not to keep you waiting, I might just grab my hairdryer. Excuse me, everyone. Might be a little bit of a noise here. I want to make sure that that top area is dry, because that's what I'm going to be going at first. So excuse me a second. All right. So next, so this is still drying a little bit. It's with the hairdryer, that's still quite warm. So I'll while that's just cooling down a bit, I'll do the water, which is almost like, it's going to be almost like a glaze, but in a few places I might leave some of this warmer tint exposed. So get in a darker, a warmer blue, an ultramarine blue, for this sort of glazing of the water. And oops, and then when that's dry, I'll go in with some darker waves, just a few little thin wave-like shapes. Ultramarine blue, a little bit of burnt umber, so it's not so blue. It's a sort of a warm grayish blue. That should be all right. And I think this sort of glazing will, with the transparency of watercolor, it that warmth should just come through a little bit. Yeah, I think this will work. Let's go up to the shoreline. Tiny bit of burnt umber, mostly ultramarine blue. Lightly on the surface. Don't want to damage the paint below. And nice soft brush. Just drag it over the surface. Again, watch the consistency of this. Actually, the water is a little bit lighter. This blue color is a little bit lighter on the right. Again, because of that light coming from the right. So a little bit more. It's nice and dry. Make sure it's dry. So the side of the brush. Don't work it in too much. Just keep it Actually pick up some of that red. And then a good straight line there where we've got the base of the steps coming down. There we are, done. So that's sort of like part 2 of the water. I'm going to go with the darker waves later on. Right, back to the shadows. These all important shadows for the buildings, defining their form and the shape of them, adding in the contrast between the light and the darks. The shadows on the whole are, well, thinking about the temperature, they're generally, well, they've got to be warm, haven't they? But there are a few that are a little bit cooler that we identified on Pat Chat. Mainly, I guess, further back. All right, so up there, that could be quite cool. Possibly cool there. So think of the temperature of the shadow and how dark it's going to be as well. Right, and think about edges. That's the other thing. Hard and soft edges. A bit like our Sedona, Arizona mountain scene where we had shadows there, hard edge, soft edge, same thing. All right. So let's mix up my shadows there or up here. I'll just go up here. I've generally mixed my darks there, cools there, warms there. So let me just mix something warm up here. So what color should we have? Well, ultramarine blue, maybe a bit of burnt sienna. Is always a good color, possibly a little bit of cat red in that as well. Right, I think that's dry enough now and it's cooled down. As I say, sometimes when I use the hairdryer, the surface of the paper can be a little bit too warm. So you start painting, it just dries too quickly. You want to sometimes give yourself a little bit of time to do things. Now that shape of that temple is not symmetrical. Do you see? So I'm going to have to try and compensate with my shadows. Right, not too much paint on the brush. When I was laying down my wash, I was holding the brush like that. I'm now holding it more carefully towards the brush end, and got a bit of neutral tint here to get in a little bit of extra darkness, and then get in the shape of the shadows. So excuse me while I'm a little bit quiet now. I'm sort of concentrating on these shadow shapes. Right, let's get in the left-hand side of temple number 1 and those sort of moldings on the side. So difficult. This is where you need a good point to the brush. And then with these brush marks, just try and get in the shape of these moldings coming down that left-hand side. There's a bit of glare on the screen. I can see you'll see how that appears in a minute. Right, let's do temple number 2. That's just still a little bit damp there, but doesn't matter. Dark shadow on the left. And then we've got the shadow coming down the side of the tower, which is defining, we're sort of negatively painting around that smaller tower to the left. Like that. And notice I'm just picking up color from the palette, not actually adding any more water to my brush. Bit of cobalt blue, bit of ultramarine blue, where I want to go a bit cooler. And then check my brush. Then we've got the little towers on the left here. And go up to tower number 1. Gradually working my way over. The first of these sort of stepped pattern of shadows coming down. Coming down the tiers of buildings. Right. Temple number 3. Ooh, a bit too blue. And we spotted a dome type building here. Really weird structure. We were wondering whether it's some kind of Islamic building, but maybe not. Okay, gradually come along that skyline, go over to the right-hand side and just form that little, that's quite a prominent bit of shadow in here. Right, there's a large, almost triangular shadow shape there with a bit of a cool shadow. It's starting to take shape, I think. Now, back to the left-hand side and back to temple number 1. Make sure I've got a good point on my brush. Could actually do this with a smaller detail brush, but there we go. It's that little extension to the right of temple number 1, and then over to the left. We've got a big shadow coming away from this monument here, and then coming down to the shoreline, the start of these square buildings. And then this whole area is so complicated. Just keep it loose, all right? Just create not so dark, but just a few little geometric shapes in there, just to give the impression of something going on. Here I'm using the flat edge of my brush just to sort of create some shapes with flat edges. And then coming down to the shoreline, we've got these these geometric shapes again. We're getting there. Keep looking at the photo for inspiration. Just try and create some expressive marks, squares, rectangles, arches. But just think about where some of those shapes might be obscured by something else in front of them. There's, yeah, to the left here, there's another shadow sort of coming down. It sort of comes down the right-hand side of temple number 2, and then along the top of that balcony, strong line there, and then up to that kind of funny dome building. Yeah, I think that's it for the main shadow shapes. What's next? Details, boats, waves, figures, steps. Actually, over here, let's define a shadow here. There we are. And I also wanted a dark shape around my figure, my light figure there. So just make this up. Paint around that figure. There we go. Hopefully a little bit of a focal point there. Right, boats, blues and red. That's a brownish one. Red, blue, brown. Red. Then red for this one here. I'll ignore the writing up the side, the advertising. There are more boats behind this one, but just keep it simple. then a blue boat. These boats, they've probably been bashed about a bit. They need a little bit of repainting, some of them. And let's get in our brown boat there. There we go. Okay, I will stop for any questions. Oh, there's no questions. I don't think so. All right. Right. It's detail time. The fifth D. Go down a size of brush, and here we are. Of course, as I say, putting in the details, lines, verticals, horizontals, windows, figures, just pulling it all together, connecting a few things as well. Now with the windows, not all the windows, all right, just suggesting a few of them, and not too like perfectly spaced. You know, these are old buildings, so we've got to create that kind of impression of these old buildings. Right. Honestly, any old color will do for this. Not black, but something dark, and not too much water on the brush. You'll see that some of my brush marks they're almost like a dry brush mark. Now I am going to try and emphasize the top of this building. And the windows up there. Then we've got some lines appearing. I'm just making up some of these lines. They're probably not 100% correct, but just to give the impression of, I've smudged that work a little bit, just to give the impression of some of those lines. Maybe if while that's still drying, let me just go over here a little bit more. We'll do the top of the tower of the temple number 2. Now, the front of this temple is quite ornate, and that's where we just want to give the impression of a few. Do you see with these marks just a dab, dragging it down? We've got the impression, hopefully, of the front of that building. And then the building behind temple number 3, got a bit of a line going down like that. We've got to put in the top of that tower, just a few little marks for the tower itself. And then those little arches. I'm going to have to get the hair dried. I'm smudging my work in a second. Yeah, I've got three main areas here that's still quite wet. 1, 2, 3. There we go. Right, back to the buildings in the background. Let's get into some windows. Let's start these off. So with my little brush, do you see I've got a little bit of a flat edge? So just turning the brush, that'll give me a thin line. Turn it 180, that'll give me a thicker line. So at a sort of 45-degree angle, I can get in a window. So 1, 2, 3. Just try and do it in one in my style. Not too thick, this paint. There's my flat edge again. So smaller windows here. I'm just really creating the impression of these windows. I'm not really copying the photo exactly. Just creating the overall impression of those windows. And some of those vertical lines for balconies, terraces, and the like. Let's put in a few of these steps. Same brush. So I could do this with a rigger brush, quite narrow lines. Down to the shoreline. We'll add some figures in there in a minute. A few little details too. Temple number 1. And we've got some space to fill in over here on the left. Another cat, flight of steps. Coming down. Bigger for the boat. Waterline for the boats. Always a good idea to add in that darker line. Just makes them more boat-like. Add in a darker figure here, standing up in the boat. Not sure if that's allowed, but and then some figures. Now be careful with these figures, don't make them too large. You've got to think about the scale and depth, so these figures are going to be quite small. Few on the shoreline. Might just add in a bit of warmer colours to some of these figures. I know some of you mentioned the saffron clothing of very traditional colours of the local dress and clothing there. Right, this area in here. Right, I've got again some square windows for these buildings on the shoreline. They're kind of open windows, and we think there might be some sort of shrine or something to commemorate people with. Another, just make these sort of squares up, come down to that boat. Another square in there. Few verticals. We need a tower, a spike on temple number 1. few more windows on that side. Just to fill in that space there. This modernish building over here. I'm going to ignore all the air conditioning units that are there. There's too much detail. It's way over there on the right. Columns for that entrance. Now, there is a danger here that I start adding in too much detail and it all starts looking a bit too busy. So I'm just going to apply a few more details. I've got to get the waves in for the river, the Ganga. So miss out the building behind that. I think that's worked quite well, actually, missing out that building behind that. Makes it sort of silhouetted nicely against the sky. Quite like that. Need to connect that. Need to connect a few more lines in there. A few more darker figures, then I'll start putting in the waves. Let's have some figures over here. How big are the figures there? Quite small. You probably can't see this. I'll take a photo of this and share it on Patreon for you. Yeah, just a couple of figures coming down the steps there. There's all sorts of rubbish going on over that side. We pointed out these tarpaulins, the blue tarpaulin. Let me just get in some of those blues, like a sort of. Let me choose a lavender, a little bit of cobalt blue, and let's see if we can get in a sort of tarpaulin shape there, and there. It's sort of that colour is just sort of replicating a few little places. All right, some saffron coloured. Well, I've got cadmium orange. Let's get in. A bit lighter. Some darker clothing for that figure in the boat. Right, waves. So I will what color? These waves, they're quite narrow, but I got to get that sort of elliptical shape. So, what brush? Let's try with this brush first of all. No, not too watery. It's got to be fairly opaque. We've got to be quite dark. ultramarine blue, a bit of burnt umber maybe, bit of neutral tint, not black, and then trying to get that shape there. So these waves are going to be very narrow in the distance, just a few of them, and then thicker in the foreground. Bit of a trail of reflections going on there. So watch the edge again. Yeah, I think that's working all right. Trying to make that water look a little bit more realistic. Bit of movement in the water as well. And that glazing, that transparency is showing through. Just leave those little light areas untouched. When you go to the edge, go over the edge. Don't stop before it. There we go. Just a few more. Don't overdo it. Again, when you look at the photo, there's so many of these little marks. If you put them all in, it would just look too busy. Perhaps a few more around by the boat there. Perhaps that might be a little bit of a, I guess this boat is going that way, so there might be a little bit of sort of wake. There we are. I think that's enough. Right. I had a little figure there. Okay, I think I'm nearly there. I'll just put in a few lights with some white gouache, and then I'll call it a day. Or would I need a bit of shadow underneath that tarpaulin? Yes. Right, thin brush, small brush, thin brush. Could use rigger. This brush should be all right. Now I've got some white gouache down here in the bottom right corner, and it's hardened, so I just need to soften it up a bit till I get the right consistency and take off that top layer of red. This is where we can put in some verticals, some lighter clothed figures, just a few little lighter tops to them. Let's do this one here. Perhaps there could be a little bit of a reflection for that figure there, and then a few of these vertical poles that we see in the on the foreground. In the foreground, on the shore, there's a pole there. Not too many. Yeah, don't overdo it with the white paint. Says he, continuing on. Ooh, I want to keep that figure dark. Be a square sign or something like that there. Yeah, I think I am about done. There are some flags. There are some flags on the tops of these towers here. Triangular flags. But not too much detail. I want to keep that light. There we are. I think I'm done. There could be some shadow on that tarpaulin. But essentially, I'm done. The ancient city of Varanasi, get it right, Varanasi on the Ganga, and a very complicated scene, trying to simplify it, thinking about the values, thinking about the composition, the balance of the temples there, the boats as well, trying to have that balance of the right level of detail just to depict the scene with the architectural details on the towers, the windows as well, the boats and the people. You've got to have people in there because it's a very busy scene. Lots and lots of figures in there.